I gave him life twice. First from my womb, then from my kidney. He thanked me with an eviction notice. They say a mother's love is endless, that she gives without question, that she would suffer in silence just to see her child smile. And Esther did. From threadbare shoes to sleepless nights, to hospital beds and second jobs. She did it all for David. No one warned her that love, when handed to the wrong hands, doesn't just go unnoticed. Gets used. She never asked for anything in return. Not a birthday card. Not a thank you. Not even a visit. Just the comfort of knowing her son had a better life than she did. But even that was too much to ask. One morning, with nothing but a folded letter in her hand and a single suitcase by her side, Esther stood outside the home she helped build. The door didn't slam. It closed slowly, deliberately. Behind it, the son she once carried for 9 months, now told her without words she was no longer welcome. The house was warm, but her name wasn't on the deed. She gave him a part of her body so he could live. He gave her the cold cement steps of a porch she used to sweep. What could drive a child to discard the very woman who gave him everything? And what happens when that mother, heartbroken but not helpless, decides enough is enough? Because sometimes the quiet ones are not the weakest, just the most patient. Her name is Esther. She was never the type to speak over others. Never the one to complain. You could pass her in a crowd and never guess the weight she carried on her back. She had no plaques on the wall.
No fram digris.
No stories of luxurious vacations or dinner parties. What she had was a sewing machine, a worn Bible, and a son. She became a widow before she became a woman in her own eyes. David was barely a toddler when her husband, Samuel, died suddenly. A faulty brake on a delivery truck ended his life in an instant, leaving Esther with unanswered questions, unpaid bills, and a child too young to understand what funeral meant. While other women her age dreamed of love, Esther was learning how to patch old clothes, cook soup from bone scraps, and walk a child to school barefoot in the rain, just so he wouldn't miss a class. For over 30 years, she worked as a seamstress. Quietly, tirelessly, mending tears in the fabric of other people's lives, while hers slowly unraveled behind the curtain. Brides would come in smiling, measuring their waists and talking about honeymoons. Esther would smile back, never once mentioning that her own wedding dress was borrowed, that she was too poor to afford a photograph from that day. I stitched clothes for other people's weddings, she once said, while never wearing a wedding gown myself. She stitched, and sacrificed, and served. All for David. She turned down a scholarship, an adult education program at the community college, because the tuition meant David wouldn't eat for a week. When he was sick in primary school, she stayed up 3 nights sewing through fever just to afford the medication. When he scored top marks in high school, she sold the only piece of gold she owned, her wedding ring, to buy him his first phone. No one ever saw her cry. Not when rent was late. Not when clients refused to pay. Not even when the lights were cut off and she sewed under a kerosene lamp until her eyes turned red. But David saw her strength. He saw her endurance. And over time he stopped seeing her at all. As he grew older, something shifted. First, it was the way he'd lower his voice when speaking to her in front of his schoolmates. Then it was how he asked her not to visit him at university without calling first. Esther noticed. Mothers always notice. But she said nothing. Instead, she kept sending money. Sometimes small, sometimes everything she had, even when the rent was overdue, even when there was no meat in her stew. Because to her, that's what mothers do. Love, she believed, is not measured by how much you say, but by how much you give when nothing is left. And when David graduated, when he wore his gown and posed for pictures with friends, Esther sat quietly at the back, wearing the same pair of shoes she bought 8 years ago. Her hands applauded, but her heart was heavy. Heavy not with regret but with a growing ache. A quiet ache. The ache of a mother watching her child drift farther into a world she no longer recognized. But even then, she never imagined what was coming. Because love like hers doesn't come with conditions. But it does come with consequences. Long before the silence, there was laughter. In a cramped one-room apartment with leaking ceilings and cracked windows, Esther built a kingdom out of nothing. David never saw the cracks. What he saw were warm hands baking birthday cakes from leftover flour and mashed bananas. He saw nighttime homework done under candlelight while the generator in the next compound hummed loudly in the background. She She made toys from cloth, turned spoons into drums, and found ways to make beans and rice taste like a feast. On nights when the rain was too loud to sleep, Esther would hum lullabies. Not ones from nursery books, but ones passed down from her mother. Songs that smelled like old wood, sounded like comfort, and felt like home. And David, young and bright-eyed, would hold her hand and say, "One day, I'll build you a house with white tiles and big windows. You won't have to sew again." She believed him. Every word. Not because she was naive, but because it came from the same mouth that used to call her my angel after a scraped knee. But time has a strange way of testing promises. University brought a new version of David. One that Esther struggled to recognize. He began speaking differently, his accent stretched out, his phone stayed silent even when she called. When he came home it was always brief, like a man stopping by, not returning. He no longer ate her food with excitement. He picked at it, criticized the oil, asked if she had ever heard of cholesterol. And then came the girlfriend, Sarah. Esther only met her once. And even then it wasn't an introduction, it was a quick wave from the car window. Sarah didn't step out. Later that evening, David had asked her not to wear those wrapper and head ties when visiting him on campus. Said it looked too local. Esther nodded, quietly. But inside something stung. It wasn't the words. It was the message, that the very hands that fed him, the clothes she wore while stitching his future, were now his embarrassment. Her visits grew fewer. His calls shorter. His tone colder. Still she sent him small packages. Dried fish, groundnut, prayers folded into old newspapers. She always added a note, "I miss your voice. Eat well. Mama." Most times there was no reply. Then the silence broke with a phone call. It came on a rainy Tuesday. The kind of rain that soaks even when you're under a roof. Her hands were deep in thread when the phone rang. "He collapsed in class," they said. "His kidneys, something is wrong. It's serious." At the hospital, the room was quiet except for the beeping machines. David looked pale, far smaller than she remembered. Doctors spoke in heavy terms. Renal failure, dialysis, donor match. It was too soon. Too much. And yet, Esther didn't hesitate. She didn't ask about cost, risk, pain, or recovery. She simply said, "Test me. I'm his mother." She was the only match. But this time, giving life wouldn't be as simple as birth. This time, it would require opening her body to save the very child who had started closing the door on her soul. And still, without hesitation, without bitterness, she said yes. She never imagined that this act of love would be used as a weapon, because what came after wasn't gratitude. It was the slowest kind of erasure, deliberate, calculated, and final. The surgery was scheduled on a Monday. Esther signed the consent forms with steady hands, even as her blood pressure wavered. No one asked if she was afraid. No one checked to see if she had anyone to wait with her in the hallway. David's wife, Sarah, barely made eye contact. She waited, quietly. For a mother, the thought of death comes second to the fear of losing a child. So when she was wheeled into that sterile white theater, Esther whispered only one thing under her breath: "Let him live." The pain after surgery was unlike anything she had ever known. Every breath was a reminder. Every movement a punishment. Her stitches pulled with each shift in the hospital bed, and her back felt like it had carried a lifetime's worth of sorrow. She remembered when she gave birth to David. That pain came with promise, with joy, with hope. This pain, it came with silence. David recovered quickly. Youth, they said, was on his side. He was up in days. Laughing. Taking calls. Sending selfies to friends. Esther, on the other hand, struggled to walk across the room. She waited for him to visit her bed. He didn't. On the 5th day she was discharged.
No balloons. No flowers.
No thank you. Just a ride home with Sarah, who kept glancing at her watch, impatient with every bump in the road. The home she returned to wasn't hers. Not anymore. It didn't smell like warmth. It didn't sound like comfort. Her small room was in the basement, a converted storage space with no window, one rickety fan, and a mattress too thin for her aching back. They had promised it was temporary. Just until you're better, David had said, his tone flat. She waited for warm soup. Instead she got silence. She waited for kindness. Instead she got instructions. Don't touch the curtains. We don't eat that kind of food here. Please knock before coming upstairs. Days passed. Then weeks. Esther folded her wrappers neatly each morning, cleaned her tiny room and stayed quiet. Her body healed slowly, but her spirit began to break. Her medication ran out once. She asked. Sarah said they were managing expenses right now. Esther began making her own herbal teas, boiling bitter leaves the way her mother taught her. When David's friends visited, she was told to stay downstairs. It's just a private meeting, they said. You'll be more comfortable resting anyway. Resting. It wasn't rest. It was rejection. The woman who gave her son life twice was now a guest in the shadows of his comfort. The meals changed too. Often there wasn't enough for three. She told them she wasn't hungry. She told them the medicine made her lose appetite. But in truth, hunger was the only feeling she had left. And yet she never raised her voice. Not once. One night, just before dawn, Esther woke to faint voices above her. The floorboards creaked, but the words were clear. Too clear. It was Sarah. Speaking low, but not low enough. Once she dies, we'll sell this place. Get something in Ohio. She's old. It won't be long now. Esther sat upright. Her hands trembled, but not from weakness. It wasn't the words that hurt the most. It was the certainty in them. The calculation. The decision already made. She wasn't just unwanted, she was unneeded. And to them nearly expired. A womb. A kidney. A stepping stone. She stared at the ceiling and whispered to no one. So that's what I became. The days that followed felt like echoes, each one louder than the last, though no one ever raised their voice. Esther noticed small changes at first. A whisper between David and Sarah that stopped when she entered the room. Paperwork left carelessly on the dining table. A file with her name on it, slightly open. But she never touched it. Never asked. She believed, despite everything, that her son would not betray her further, that what had been said in the quiet of the night was just careless talk, not a settled decision, until the letter came, folded neatly in a white envelope, placed on the table she once wiped down each morning, addressed formally. Notice to vacate 30 days.
No conversasten. No explanasten.
Just legal ink typed with detachment, served with the coldness of someone who knew she had nowhere else to go. David claimed the house was his, that Esther had gifted it to him in gratitude after the surgery, that she no longer had a legal right to stay. A gift. Esther stared at the letter for hours. The words blurred and swam, but the message was loud. Leave. She asked David for clarity. His response. Mummy, you're old. You need rest. You said yourself you don't feel strong anymore. Let us take care of things now. It's not personal. Not personal. She had carried that boy through 9 months of hunger and pain. She had bled for him to bring him into the world, bled again to keep him in it. And now she was being erased. Neatly. Quietly. Like a stain on new tiles. She reached out to the pastor who had once prayed over David's healing. The same one who had said, Esther, your faith will move mountains. He listened. He nodded. And then he said, it's a family matter. I don't want to take sides. Her own siblings, those she once fed from her own soup pot, told her, you must have done something to make him act like that. Anyway, it's your problem. You always thought you were the strong one. Her strength had become their excuse to abandon her. But what shattered her spirit was not David, or even Sarah. It was Jane, her niece, the child Esther had taken in when her sister died. The girl she had clothed, fed, nursed through fevers, walked to school, cried with during heartbreak. Jane was the one who called her Mama too. And yet, when the court date arrived, when Esther stood alone on one side of the room, wrapped in her cleanest wrapper and shoes too thin for the rainy season, Jane sat across the aisle. With David. She testified. Said she had heard Esther say the house was David's. That she remembered a conversation during the post-surgery period, where Esther clearly said she wanted to give the house as a thank you. Esther's knees didn't buckle, but her heart folded inward. She didn't speak during the hearing. She didn't interrupt, even when lies were stacked like bricks against her. She just sat there, listening to years of love being rewritten as leverage. The judge postponed judgment. Outside the courthouse, Jane couldn't look her in the eye. David didn't try. Esther walked home. Not because she couldn't afford transport, though she couldn't, but because her body needed time to catch up with what had just happened. With every step, memories flashed. David's first tooth. His first school uniform. The time she borrowed money just to buy him a second-hand bicycle. The letter he wrote in JSS 1 that said, "My mummy is my hero." She wondered where that boy went, or if he was ever really there. In her basement room that night, Esther sat with a cup of hot water.
No sugar. No milk.
Just silence. She stared at the eviction notice again. Counted the days. 28 left. And then something shifted inside her. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even pain anymore. It was something colder. Quieter. The feeling of a woman who realized they had taken everything, except her memory. And memory she knew could be a weapon. They had underestimated her. But she hadn't forgotten a thing. 28 days became 21. Then 14. Then 7. Esther didn't argue. She didn't plead. She didn't protest. She just folded. Folded her wrappers with care. Folded the loose threadbare nightgown she'd worn for over a decade. Folded the faded picture of David as a baby, the one with mashed yam on his cheek. She packed her things into 2 nylon bags. One for clothes. One for memories. No goodbyes were exchanged. David didn't come down to see her off. Sarah stayed upstairs, humming while brushing her hair in the mirror. The house was still. But not in a peaceful way. It was the stillness of something finished. Something buried. As she stepped outside that morning, the sun didn't shine. It was cloudy but not raining. Dry skies that somehow made the world feel emptier. Esther didn't look back. There was nothing behind her that she hadn't already lost. The shelter was on the other side of town. A room with 4 women, 3 rusted bunk beds, 1 shared bathroom, and silence that wasn't peace. It was exhaustion. No one asked what brought her there. Everyone had their own stories, their own betrayals. Esther found a corner near the window. She sat by it each night, writing her thoughts on scraps of paper. Letters with no stamps. Words with no audience. Her body ached differently now. The surgical scar throbbed. Her blood pressure danced dangerously. She walked with a slowness that wasn't age. It was fatigue that wrapped itself around her bones. But it wasn't the hardest part. That came on a Wednesday. Her biannual checkup. Post-surgery protocol. She wore her cleanest blouse, took 2 buses, and walked the final stretch to the hospital. Each step carefully measured against the tightness in her chest. The hospital was bright. Too bright. The kind that made everything feel exposed. She checked in at reception and sat down, hands folded in her lap. That's when she saw him. David. Across the corridor. Standing tall and crisp white. Health returned to his cheeks. His arms around Sarah. Laughing. Smiling. He passed her. Not a glance. Not a pause. Not a flicker of recognition. As though she had never carried him. Never held his hand through fevers. Never traded her blood for his breath. As though she was a stranger. Esther didn't cry. She simply sat still. Staring forward. Watching him disappear into a room with no hesitation. A nurse tapped her shoulder. "Ma, it's your turn." Her legs moved, but something in her stayed behind on that bench. That night, back at the shelter, Esther pulled out the photograph again. The one she'd carried through it all. It was worn now. Creased at the corners. David's baby smile frozen in time. A reminder of a boy who once clung to her scarf and said, "Don't leave me, Mama." She placed it beside her bed. Beside the bowl of water she used to rinse her face. Then came the memories. The lullabies hummed in dim hospital rooms. His small arms around her neck after scraped knees. The time he stood in the kitchen, holding a spoon and saying, "I'll build you a palace, Mama." The day she spent her last cash to buy him a used graduation gown. The wedding picture she only saw on social media. His hand on Sarah's waist, but no seat for Esther. She whispered into the silence. "My silence used to be peace. Now it is pain." The next morning she woke up early. Before the others stirred. She boiled water. Pressed her blouse. Wrote another letter, this one she tore into pieces. She stared at herself in the mirror. Lines on her face that spoke of war without battles. Scars that weren't visible but lived in the spaces where love once sat. And for the first time in months, her eyes held something different. Not despair. Not weakness. but clarity. A slow-burning, quiet understanding that what had been taken from her could never be replaced. But what they didn't know was what she still had. And what she was about to do would be remembered. In a small wooden box wrapped in cloth and stored beneath her bed at the shelter, Esther kept her most fragile things. A broken necklace from her wedding day. A letter from David in elementary for where he wrote, "I want to marry you when I grow up, Mummy," and a folded set of land documents with faded ink and brittle edges. Her name was on them, next to Samuel's, her late husband. Years ago, when Samuel bought the land, he insisted they register it in both their names. Just in case, he'd said. You never know the heart of tomorrow. Esther had never told anyone. She never thought she needed to. The house they built on that land was modest, but it was theirs. She was too busy surviving to co, and after Samuel's death, she let things lie. Quiet. Undisturbed. She didn't update the records. Didn't go to court. She had believed then, as she believed for most of her life, that family came before formality. But family had failed her. And now, her silence would not be a shield. It would become her sword. One evening, Esther made her way to a modest office on the second floor of a brick building in downtown. The sign read, Whitaker & Lowe, LLP, Estate and Civil Law Attorneys. It wasn't fancy, but it was where the truth lived. She hadn't seen him in over 20 years. But the moment the door creaked open and he looked up, recognition filled his eyes. Esther, he said softly. It's been too long. She laid the documents on the table. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with purpose. I never changed the papers, she said. But I kept everything. The lawyer unfolded the old documents slowly, eyes scanning every line. He asked a few questions. She answered plainly, directly, without emotion. When he was done, he opened a drawer, pulled out a file, and placed it beside hers. This, he said, was filed by your son last year. It claims sole ownership of the property. Sworn affidavit. Witnesses. Title claim. Esther leaned forward. The signature was David's. The notary was real. The dates strategic. Weeks after her surgery. Weeks after she had handed him not just her kidney, but access to her world. She whispered, he forged it. The lawyer nodded. Yes. And not very well. There were inconsistencies. The stamp used was outdated. The witness, one of David's old school friends, had since left the country and had no idea his name was on any form. It's fraud, the lawyer said. And it's criminal. Esther didn't weep. She didn't tremble. She simply sat back in the wooden chair, her fingers interlocked, and closed her eyes. For months they had treated her like she was nothing. Like her presence was charity, like her suffering was invisible. But she had held the truth all along. Not in her voice. Not in her fists. In her records. And records, unlike people, do not lie. Over the next few weeks, Whitaker quietly built her case. Carefully. Discreetly. Esther said nothing to anyone. She returned to the shelter each day, washed her clothes, helped elderly women eat their dinner, said her prayers, and waited. In silence. While the world moved around her, she planted seeds, legal ones. Truthful ones. David never suspected. Why would he? In his mind, she had already disappeared. Erased. Pushed to the background like an old photograph you no longer frame. But he didn't know. The foundation he stood on wasn't his. Not the land. Not the house. Not even the peace he thought he had. It all still belonged to her. The law, like memory, is slow but sure. And what was once buried in a wooden box at the foot of a shelter bed was now rising to the surface. With every paper filed, every witness statement reviewed, and every false claim unraveled, Esther wasn't just fighting for property. She was reclaiming her story. Quietly. Powerfully. And soon the world would know. Revenge didn't come with thunder. Came with signatures. Court seals. And envelopes marked confidential. Esther never raised her voice. Not once. She let the truth do the talking. After the lawyer filed the fraud claim and submitted the original co-ownership documents, the court didn't take long to act. The case was clean. The evidence airtight. David had forged his way into ownership. But Esther had never surrendered it. The land, and the house built upon it, legally still belonged to her. In the ruling, the court reinstated her full ownership, citing fraud, forgery, and unlawful eviction. Her son's title was revoked, his claim erased, his rights stripped, but she didn't tell him. She didn't call. She didn't gloat. She simply moved in silence. A week later, under a name not her own, she hired a property agent. A professional. Clean. Discreet. She signed the power of attorney from the back corner of the lawyer's office. The name on the documents was Mrs. Laura. No trace of Esther. The instructions were simple. Reclaim the house. Prepare it for sale. Make it quick. Within days, an official eviction notice was drawn, signed, stamped, delivered. It was a Wednesday evening. The same kind of cloudy evening she had left that house in silence months ago. David and Sarah returned from dinner, laughing, keys in hand, unaware, until they saw the tape across the gate, until they read the bold, red ink on the white paper nailed to the door. You are hereby notified to vacate these premises within 72 hours. This property is under repossession. Confusion became panic. Panic became shouting. David made calls. None of them changed the truth. His lawyer told him, "You never owned it. You forged documents. You lost." Sarah's voice rose. David's fell. Neighbors peeked through their curtains. But the woman they needed to face never came. Because Esther wasn't there. She was seated in the front seat of a slow-moving car parked 3 houses down. Head wrapped. Eyes calm. Watching. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She simply observed the same house they once pushed her out of, now pushing them out in return. And still she said nothing. No speech. No confrontation. No final words. Just the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had been counted out, yet never truly defeated. The house was sold 2 weeks later. Legally. Cleanly. Efficiently. The proceeds? Placed in a trust. For a women's shelter. Anonymous donation. Not because she wanted to forget what happened, but because she wanted her pain to mean something. Esther disappeared again. Not because she was running, but because she had finished what she came to do. Her voice still never raised. Her presence forever remembered, because sometimes the loudest form of justice is done with silence. And when the dust settles, people may forget your name, but they will never forget how your silence made them listen. The courthouse steps had never seen so much silence. Not because there weren't voices, but because one woman's presence made everything else feel small. Esther walked slowly, her white headscarf tied neatly, a folder tucked beneath her arm. The building was familiar now. She had been here enough, filing, reviewing, signing. Not with lawyers beside her, but with dignity. As she approached the front doors, she saw him. David. His face drawn darker than usual. The confident slouch in his walk gone. His shoulders were square now, but not with pride. With weight. He stepped forward. Not with the arrogance he once carried, but with the look of a man whose world had slipped through his fingers. "Mum," she didn't stop. But she didn't walk past him either. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why would you do this to me?" Esther's eyes held no anger. Just truth. She didn't raise her voice. She never did. But her words landed heavier than any scream ever could. "You gave me nothing to lose. So I took everything I had left." David opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because there was nothing to say. Everything had already been said. Through documents, silence, eviction notices, and time. The final hearing was short. The sale confirmed. All appeals rejected. Title cleared. Case closed. David left the courthouse alone. Esther didn't watch him go. She had no more battles to fight. Not with him. Not with the past. What she wanted now was peace. Weeks later, Esther received a letter. Not from a court. Not from a lawyer. From a women's support group in the countryside, one she had quietly donated to after the house sale. They had read her anonymous note, felt the weight in her words, and decided this woman deserved more than shelter. She deserved sanctuary. Inside the envelope were keys, and a photograph of a small, quiet house near a stream, painted yellow, surrounded by trees. "Come rest here," the letter read. "Your story gave others the courage to begin theirs." Esther moved in a week later. The air was clean. The nights were quiet. And for the first time in years, She could breathe without feeling like the walls were watching her. Her health began to improve. Slowly. Naturally. The doctors were surprised. Your blood pressure is down, they said. Your kidney function's stable. They asked what changed. She smiled. Peace, she answered. That's all. Just peace. The villagers grew to know her as the woman who walked every morning with tea leaves in her basket, and a distant gaze that held lifetimes. She didn't talk about her past. But sometimes she wrote letters, prayers, and a single note she kept folded by her bedside. He didn't break me. He freed me. She never saw David again. But once, months later, she heard that his marriage had fallen apart. That Sarah had left with what little was left of their savings. That he had started again somewhere in the city. She didn't feel joy or sadness, just stillness, because justice hadn't come with punishment. It had come with understanding that when people strip you of everything, they never expect you to find the one thing that can't be taken. Your voice, even when that voice is silence. In that yellow house near the stream, Esther began a new ritual. Every Sunday morning after her tea, she sat at a small wooden desk by the window and wrote, not to David, not to the court, not to the world, to herself. Letters with no address.
No stamp.
No return to sender. Just ink and truth. Dear Esther, she wrote, today you remembered that silence isn't surrender. It's survival. You gave your body to save a child. You gave your home to build his future. And when he took everything, you gave yourself back. Page after page, she wrote the chapters of her life the way they should have been told, from her voice. For once, not as someone's mother or someone's burden, but simply Esther. She never saw David again. There were no apologies.
No reunions.
No miracle change of heart. Just absence. And she didn't chase it. Because some wounds don't close with words. They close with space. And that she had now. In full. As the months passed, Esther began volunteering at a small center in the nearby village. It served older women, many of them abandoned, widowed, or silenced by years of invisible suffering. She never told them everything about her past. But when she spoke, they listened. Because her voice carried something they recognized. Truth. She taught them to write. Helped them register their land. Sat with them in hospital queues. Listened to them cry without rushing to stop the tears. And when one of them whispered, my daughter called me a witch because I asked her for food, Esther just held her hand and said, you are not cursed. You are not weak. You are a woman who survived love. In one of her letters to herself, Esther wrote a line she never showed anyone. Some children break you. Not because you failed, but because you loved too deeply. She never said it to shame herself. She said it to forgive herself. Every evening, she would sit on her porch and watch the sun fade into the trees. Sometimes she hummed lullabies she hadn't sung in years. Other times she sat in stillness listening to nothing, because silence had finally become peace again, not pain. And when people in the village asked, who is that quiet woman in the yellow house who always smiles with her eyes? They were told, that's Mama Esther. She used to be broken. Now she builds. Her name was never in newspapers. Her story never trended online. But if you ever sat with her, truly sat, you'd understand the weight of a woman who carried betrayal in her bones, and still walked straight. Giving life should never cost you your dignity. Yet for many women it does. They carry generations on their backs. Give up careers, dreams, even parts of their own bodies, just to be cast aside when they're no longer useful. But Esther's story is not just about betrayal. It's about survival. About finding strength in stillness, power in silence, and rebirth in spaces where everything once felt lost. She never raised her hand, never sought revenge through violence or vengeance. She chose truth. She chose peace. And above all, she chose herself. Because sometimes, your silence is not weakness. It is survival. And survival, when wrapped in wisdom, is the loudest victory of all. Maybe you're watching this right now, and you've known this kind of pain. Maybe you too gave everything, your love, your time, your health, your name, to someone who forgot. Someone who erased you the moment you no longer served their need. Maybe you've suffered in silence, but hear this. Your voice matters. Your story is not too small. It is not too late. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you gave your all to, if you've ever been made to feel invisible after building someone else's world, share your truth in the comments. You never know who your story will give strength to. Esther's name may not be known by many, but her story now lives, because she endured, and because you chose to listen. Let her remind us all. You can lose everything, your home, your family, even your health. But if you find your peace, you have won. For every woman who was told she was too quiet, too soft, too kind, this is your power. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share. Turn on notifications for more powerful true stories. And remember, silence is not the end. Sometimes, it's the beginning.